Welcome to Grandma Has ADHD, where attention deficit doesn't retire when you do. I'm your host, Jami Shapiro, sharing stories and laughs about ADHD in our wonderful senior community. Whether you're a grandparent discovering your neurodivergent sparkle later in life, or someone who loves a grandmother who can remember every detail of her wedding day, but not where she put her glasses, this podcast is for you. Join me for aha moments and celebrating the beautiful chaos of the ADHD brain at any age. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And for more daily doses of connection and community, come join our vibrant Grandma Has ADHD Facebook group, where we share stories, tips, and maybe help each other find those missing glasses together. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Grandma Has ADHD. Today, we are talking to somebody who is both a grandma, somebody who has ADHD, and is an ADHD professional. So I guess that's actually more than both. Welcome to the podcast, Wilma Fellman. She has a master's in education and has been a licensed professional counselor with more than 35 years of experience. She specializes in attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As we were talking about her bio before we started this show, she's written a lot of books. So typical ADHD fashion, overachiever. But one of the reasons that she got involved and we were connected is that she wrote a book about career development. And I guess was it in later life? Or tell me a little bit about that. And then I am sure that I have missed a lot in your bio. So I am going to let you, I think no one is going to tell it better than you do.
Thank you, Jami. I appreciate it. Yeah, I wrote a book called Finding a Career That Works for You. And it's a career and life planning book. The idea is, and will always be, that we live our life in chapters, and there is the school chapter, and then there's the after school chapter, and then there's the after work chapter, which is relevant to this particular podcast. I think so many people plan for the school chapter and they plan, hopefully, for the career chapter. I spent 35 years helping people plan for the career chapter. And it was towards the end of that, working with the Edge Foundation, that we started to realize that there was another whole chapter that was getting longer and longer as people were retiring earlier and earlier. And people don't want to retire and rock on their porch anymore. They want something meaningful to do. And so there's a whole other chapter to take a look at in terms of planning. And I think typical of ADHD people, they don't really plan. Often they get to the point that they need to be and panic that they retired on a Friday and Monday morning they have a full-blown anxiety attack because they don't know what to do with their lives. So I think it's real important to take a look at that piece.
I agree. And I think we talked about that you have personally come out of retirement 3 times.
Yes.
Is that right? Case in point. So, okay. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I always like to start with your own discovery of ADHD and how you found the work so people can get to know you and identify with your story. Mm-hmm. And then, want to dive more into the work that you do. So tell me about Wilma and how she discovered her ADHD.
Well, like many adults with ADHD, I am old enough not to have discovered it early enough. I discovered it when my youngest son was going through some terrible challenges right at the first grade. And in my lectures and seminars and so forth, I always called him my poster child for ADHD because he really checked all the boxes. It was going through his workup, and this was way back in the early 80s.
Wow.
when women were not considered candidates for ADHD. It was little boys who ran around a lot and were hyperactive. And so when Jeff went through his evaluation, which was multifaceted, they took a look at his dad to see if there were signs of ADHD in him, and there weren't. And kind of as an afterthought, they took a look at my life, and it just checked all the boxes. It made my struggle as an inattentive female in school, daydreaming, looking out the window, definitely not reaching my potential until college. It made it all make sense. So I had a very passionate connection to working with this population.
Wow. So you have known since the 1980s that you had G.
Yes.
So you're really a woman pioneer in this industry, which in this space. Well, you know, right, because they used to believe that it was little boys and that little boys would outgrow it.
Yes.
And it was funny. I was at the International ADHD conference a couple of weeks ago, which is how you and I connected. And I was telling someone about the Grandma Has ADHD podcast, and they jokingly said, "Oh, you mean we're not going to outgrow it?" And I said, "Yeah, clearly, you know, just because that was the big joke, was that a lot of us were not little boys and none of us are outgrowing it." So I always love to hear a woman, which is why I did name the podcast Grandma, a woman's perspective of what ADHD looked like for her. Because as I shared with you when we were talking about the podcast, who's going to be listening to this is going to be women who are discovering that they have ADHD. Maybe they're now looking at their mothers, and some mothers are, "Oh, this makes so much sense," like my mom, who's really open to it. And then there are going to be some who are coming to the conversation, "I don't know that I want to have this conversation. Why do I need to dig up this box?" You know, so I'm really trying to educate as many people as I can so that they have the tools that they need to improve, because when you know better, you do better. Okay. So you saw it in your son. Do you have any other children or grandchildren with ADHD?
I have another son who shows no signs of it, and he just turned 50. And so he was my firstborn. And I have to say that, going along with what you said about women in particular, I was very smug when I had him because he did everything right. He was easy. He didn't have any particular challenges. And I just assumed I was the best mother that walked the planet. And then I had my second, and he was, again, the ADHD poster child. And I realized that it has very little to do with the parenting issue. I know some people think that it is the result of poor planning or poor parenting. And I always liked to tell the story about my second child, who was hospitalized when he was 6 weeks old here at our children's hospital in Detroit for a neurological baffling disorder where his eyes would roll downward, sort of the opposite of a seizure look, and rapidly rolling down. And he was 6 weeks old. We were freaking out. He was at Children's Hospital for 10 days. They looked at every possible reason, including epilepsy. They had to flash a strobe light in his eyes and try and induce seizure, because infants don't, even if they're going to be epileptic, they don't go into seizure that young. So they had to cause it. And they swung him around by his ankles and flashed a strobe light in his eyes. And I was freaking out. It was a nightmare.
Yes.
At the end, they looked for optic tumors that might explain it. And at the end of the 10 days, they sent him home with the diagnosis of minimal brain dysfunction, which is what ADHD was called before it was called ADHD. And so when I was lecturing, I liked to tell people that I didn't have a chance yet to be a poor parent. He was 6 weeks old, and it dissolved. It went away. But for a while, they told us, we don't know if he's going to walk or talk or what we're dealing with here. but it was definitely something neurological. It was definitely something that he was born with, and how it developed, all things considered, was a fraction of what we thought was going to happen.
You hear those stories where someone's told you're really not going to amount to anything. You should plan your career as a janitor. And then you have all of these brilliant ADHD people who figure out what their passion is and pursue it. And, write. How many books have you written, Wilma?
Well, I wrote 2 books. One is a poetry book on ADHD and what it feels like to live inside an ADHD body, and what it feels like to parent a child who also lives inside an ADHD body. The second book was Finding a Career That Works for You, and it was a workbook that is still being used by coaches and counselors who are working with clients on career development choices. What makes a good choice given all the challenges of ADHD? And the third book was a chapter that I was invited to write in Kathleen Nadeau's book, Understanding Women with ADHD, where she asked me to write the chapter on career development with females with ADHD.
I love that. She's been a guest on the podcast, and she absolutely is a pioneer in the aging space, as she was with women and ADHD. We're going to take a break, but I do have a couple of things that I want to talk about when we come back that you touched on. But I also wondered if you happen to know or remember any of those poems or could recite them. Maybe what it feels like to have ADHD. So when we pause, it'll give you a chance to find it. And then I also want to ask you, how do you feel? And again, we're going to pause and come back, but I want you to be thinking of this question. How do you feel having ADHD impacted you as a mother, and the impact that it maybe had on your kids? I know it's something that I wish that I had known when I was a mother of young children, and I didn't discover it until my oldest child was in middle school. So we are going to take a short break, listen to a word from our sponsors, and then I would love it if you would share one of those poems, and we'll continue the conversation.
I would love to. Thank you.
If you are listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you or a loved one is feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of ADHD or disorganization. Since those of us with ADHD tend to struggle with where to begin big projects like moving or home organizing, the Silver Linings Transitions team can guide you through the process, breaking tasks down into manageable steps or handling every detail. There's a reason our team carries magic wands when we work with our clients. We can pack and move your entire home, and you won't have to miss a day of work or touch a single box. We also provide home organizing and storage shortouts with an understanding of ADHD. If you have a home to sell, we can provide you free or discounted services when we refer you to one of our realtor partners through our realtor referral program. Visit our website at www.silverliningstransitions.com or call us at 760-522-1624 to learn more about how we can help you make your move or home organizational project magical. And we are back with Wilma Fellman. I asked Wilma if she would share that poem, and we don't even know the title yet, of what it's like to live with ADHD. So I am so glad you said yes. I can't wait to hear it. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I love these poems. They're so emotional. And the first time I ever read one out loud at a conference, an ADD conference, a young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and she said, "How do you know me?" And it was just so emotional for both of us.
And I was going to say, I do a talk called or a presentation called Grandma Has ADHD, live and in person. And I have had people come up to me and tell me that I spoke to their soul. And they hadn't even considered, they weren't at an ADHD conference. It wasn't even something that they had considered. And all of a sudden that light bulb went off. And it's just like, okay, I'm on the right path when you can connect with someone. And That is what I love about, talking to people with ADHD, because, there's so much shame that we carry around ADHD, which, by the way, none of us chose to have. And then when you meet somebody who has it and you think, wow, that is a really cool person. Maybe this club that I'm in isn't, maybe these are some really cool kids, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay.
It's so heartwarming. And it's why I retired 3 times. I kept getting pulled back in to this because it is an emotional thing that does touch our hearts. I wanted to point out that the little fictitious character on my book is a Squirtle. And I had the Squirtle before it was a cartoon character. But when I was in graduate school, we had to, as a little activity, tell what kind of an animal we felt we were most like. And I passed on the first time around. And then when they came back to me, I said, it's got to be a hybrid. I am part squirrel and part turtle. And
I've never heard that.
It just became it was my license plate for decades. And it became just the way that I thought of myself. And what I learned was that it was not uncommon for ADD individuals to be like that. We have boundless energy like a squirrel, where we can scurry around and get things done faster than the average bear. And then we are spent and we have to pull in and, like a turtle, regenerate our energies. And then we're ready to do it all over again. So for a career, it's real important to know that about yourself, because you're not the kind of person that can plod along every day with the same amount of energy or focus.
I actually have never heard that. So I was today years old. And it's so funny because I always tell people I love going to events and I'm usually the first one there. And then I'm usually the first one to leave. And I say I hit my wall and I have to go. And I've never heard that expression before. So I'm going to have to get the spelling from you on that, Squirtle. Very, very creative. And well, thank you. So, and then the other way that I have heard squirrel, it was actually in the keynote speech that Penn Holderness did at conference. He brought up a scene from Up with the dog. I don't know if you remember this, where the dog has a voice collar that converts what he's thinking to words. Mm-hmm. And he's, hi, I'm blah, blah, blah. Nice to meet you, squirrel. And so I always thought of squirrel in that context as, oh, there's a squirrel. I'm in the middle of a conversation and I've just been distracted. So you just gave me a whole new thought that I'll never think of squirrel the same way ever again. Okay.
There are a lot of us.
So your book is called The Other Me. Was that what I said?
Because the me that everybody sees is the squirrel. They don't see the turtle. And so when I first came out as an individual with ADHD, even my father, who was alive at that time, said, I didn't see it in you. I just didn't. Well, I spent a lot of energy hiding it. And I think that, too, is not uncommon for our population. That,
right. I learned about masking.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So what? Okay, I don't want to distract you from the poem anymore because I really want to hear it.
The poem is called For Rick. I wrote it for my non-ADHD child because I felt that he got the brunt of a crazy household and it was hard for him in that way. Dear Rick, I can only imagine what it was like for you in the elastic days, when each unit of time brought sprinting surprise, creative and warm, or bewildered and frustrated. We spent our gifted existence together, you and I, making our way through a sticky web, often advancing happily, often stuck in confusion, reaching each other from a primal place. I'm grateful for your endless love and patience while I learned what the web was all about, for your good nature, your smile, your warm arms around my neck, you dear child. You thought I knew what I was doing, that all parents were elastic, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, without warning. You coped with each stretch, though you paid a price. Thank you, my firstborn, for your trusting spirit that allowed me to learn the treasure of parenting. I love you.
Wow.
It's hard on any non-ADD folks that are caught in the wildfire of what's going on. And so I was happy to write that for him.
Wow. I definitely got chills. And, it's interesting. So I didn't realize that I had ADHD, as I shared with you, until my oldest was diagnosed in middle school. My middle child, speaking of genetics being what they are and not a result of parenting. So my oldest would fall asleep, go with the flow. Wherever they wanted to fall asleep, they would just lay down and fall asleep and just went with me. My middle child had OCD, had to be, even as an infant, I remember us having to leave. We had gone on a trip to see my mother-in-law. I was living in Jacksonville, Florida at the time. she was in Miami. We drove the 5 hours to see her. My child could not sleep anywhere but her crib. And so we had to pack up at, 4:00 in the morning and come home so that we could get her onto her schedule, which was so hard for me. Again, at the time, I have no idea I have ADHD and she has OCD. And then just a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't see this one coming, my youngest child was diagnosed with ADHD. So my poor middle child, who, yes, I know, I saw the shock on your face. She is surrounded by it. And she needs order and neatness. And then you have just chaos. And she's like, I love you, Mom, but I don't want to move back in with you when I graduate. That doesn't seem good for my mental health. And I would say, as ADHD people go, I actually don't have a cluttered home. My mother's home was very cluttered and it caused a lot of stress for me. And so I would say that my house is not really cluttered, but even for my daughter, it's too much chaos. Mm-hmm. So I can't even imagine how it, and then now I'm evaluating my own childhood growing up with a mother with undiagnosed ADHD. And I don't know if you know that she's the original grandma. When I put it all together that, we needed to keep looking backwards. When my child was diagnosed, I saw their diagnosis. I looked at my diagnosis, and then I spent 8 years there until I realized my mom had ADHD.
Sure. And there's going to be somebody there. If we look into it, there's a reason.
Sure. Well, I knew, interestingly, my father also has ADHD, but he was, as you described, my half brother was put on Ritalin in the 80s. And that's why when my ex-husband would say, oh, you have ADHD, I would say, no, I don't. I've been, I'm not him. I don't need Ritalin, and it wasn't diagnosed in school. So, I knew my dad had it. So I'm like, okay, well, there's the genetic link. But now I realize I had two parents with ADHD, and here I am hosting a podcast. 2 parents, 2 kids. I mean, wow.
I also want to applaud you because I believe, too, that the emphasis on ADHD in adults seems to stop at retirement. It seems to, we talk about how to do better in our job and how to get more comfortable and how to pick a job that's more suitable for who we are. Mm-hmm. But people who retire, and again, I did it 3 times, become very uncomfortable because they have no planning. And it's so simple. It's the same process that one would go through when they're graduating high school and trying to figure out what to do next, or when they're graduating college or post school and trying to figure out what to do next. It's a need to reassess all your strengths and then add in the challenges. I never believe in starting with, I'm an individual with a challenge. What can I do with that challenge? I believe that's backwards. So we start with everything that we're about, looking into our interests and our aptitudes and our personality and our values and what lights us up and what our focus pattern is, and putting all that together and then adding in the challenge. People can go on to have a retirement chapter, and sometimes it's 25 years long. Right. So it's not something to I'll just wing it and see what comes my way. Things don't come your way once you're out of the workforce. And it's isolating, and people get very worried that they're never going to find anything meaningful again. So I'm a big advocate of career and life planning. And that means that if you're facing retirement, if grandma's about to retire, that it would only help her. It's a no-lose situation to go through another evaluation of where she is now and what might be the best way to spend the next 25 years of her life. It's exciting.
Right. So tell me, what brought you out of retirement 3 times? How has that evolved?
Well, the first time I used to teach high school English and speech and debate, and I did the school play. So I retired from that. And then I was a counselor for 35 years, additional years. And then I retired from that. And then actually Denise at the Edge Foundation got me out of retirement to teach classes on Zoom to coaches working with clients who are hitting a wall on what to do. They might have been fired from several jobs or almost fired, or they leave just in time, but they're not finding fulfillment in their career. And so I worked with Train the Trainer, teaching coaches how to work with their clients on the career development piece. And then we noticed that there was a whole other piece that needed to be addressed, and that was retirement and what to do. And it's just as important as what you did during your career, but it's not given that importance automatically.
So what would you tell somebody who is, has maybe already retired and they're listening to this and bored and just realizing this is not how I want to spend the rest of I don't want to be in that rocking chair. Right. What would your advice be?
I would tell them to work with a career counselor or coach. I trained several during the course of working with the Edge Foundation that took on kind of my philosophy that you start with everything that's right and you reassess interests, aptitudes, values, personality. Typically, people do one thing. They'll take a look at, maybe they'll take an interest inventory and they think that's the end. But I could be interested in being a brain surgeon. I may not have the aptitude, or it doesn't fit my lifestyle, or it's not according to my personality. I've worked with dozens of attorneys who are good in one area of law, but not another area of law because of their personality. So it's important. And there's about 10 different categories that I outline in my book. And I also taught to coaches who went through my program in how to get a complete picture of what a person is all about. And it's the exact same process, whether it be high school, college, career, or retirement.
I love that.
Gathering the same facts.
So remind the audience again of the name of that book, and we will link it in the show notes. The name of the book.
Finding a Career That Works for You.
Perfect.
And it's a workbook, and it takes you through the process, one facet. We're multifaceted as humans. Mm-hmm. And so to just have I remember when I was in graduate school and we took an interest inventory, and it told me that I might want to look into being a clown or being a shepherd. Shepherd was the one that got me. But I do love a flock. I taught school and I taught classes and I lectured and I did workshops. So a shepherd, but not literally a shepherd. And so It's important to work with someone if it's not happening for you, someone that can help you interpret all of the pieces that you gather about yourself. And it's not a long process, but it's so valuable. And it prevents, I think, a lot of depression, anxiety that happens in retirement, particularly with our population.
That's great. That's great advice, and definitely sounds like a great book to check out for our audience. I want to, as we are wrapping up this show, I think that it would be perfect for you to talk about your cousin who you mentioned very briefly to me when we did our discovery call, because you, I believe, shared with me that he is 92 years old and was diagnosed in his 70s.
I actually have several people who are in their late 80s, early 90s, who live in an ADD body. They may not have been diagnosed because it would be way before a diagnosis was, but they're clearly ADHD people and doing phenomenal kinds of things, even in retirement. And it's exciting because it has no age limit. And the only limit is that, I'm 78 and I never went through a process to get a formal diagnosis, but my son did. And so they gave me the label by going through his process. So the older people are, the more likely they don't have a formal diagnosis, but they lived the life. They can look back and see maybe changing careers quite often or changing job situations quite often, but they have an energy that you can't beat. It's wonderful when it's harnessed, and it just needs to be harnessed. And when it's understood, it can be really a blessing and not just a challenge or a curse. I truly believe that.
Right. Absolutely. And I love when for the people who are listening to this and are not watching on YouTube, when you told me you were 78, I don't know if you saw my eyes go up because,
I'm proud.
You absolutely should be. And I did hear, we're not supposed to say you look good for a 78-year-old. Like, that's really not the correct terms to use. And I'm not even going to take that in, but you do have a glow about you. You really do. And that has definitely been one of the gifts that I have found when I meet people with ADHD is that energy and that spark. And I am so glad that you talked about the other side of that, because I absolutely have that turtle side and never knew that was really such a big part of, you're on and then you're off, right?
Yes.
So parting, yes. Like I said, my wall, any parting words for anybody who might be listening to this podcast to really make the rest of their life the best of their life? Because as you shared, we have a lot, especially we with ADHD, we have a lot to offer, and retirement does not need to slow us down.
No. None of the chapters of our life need to be slowed down at all. I guess if there were parting words, it would be that it takes so little to assess what we're all about today. We may be different today. I'm not the person today that I was 20 years ago. And that doesn't mean I've just lost function by being in my 70s. In some respects, I have a wealth of information inside of me that I couldn't have bought 20 years ago. So there are pluses and minuses, but it takes so little to assess where we are today, what lights us up today, and go after it. And in that respect, there's no limit to this. It's with us until we take our last breath. And ADD people have a lot of breath to take. So I think it's a very cool population. I have thoroughly enjoyed working with this population my whole professional life.
I love that. What an inspiration you are, and how lucky are both Rick and Jeff, which for me to remember both names is, as you know, with that poor memory.
Yes.
It was great. And they are lucky to have you as a mom. And I am sure that you are a phenomenal grandma too.
I love it. It's the best. And it enables us to make up some of those mistakes that we might have made in our elastic years, when everything was kind of crazy. Oh, it's wonderful. I love it.
Thank you so much
for having me.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for listening. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.